Hi, I'm attorney Brian A. Victor, and welcome to my podcast. Each week, I'm going to discuss various aspects of divorce and child custody. In prior podcast episodes, I discussed considerations necessary when contemplating divorce. I also talked about the differences between ending a dating relationship and ending a marriage when children are involved, and the necessity for creating a parenting plan in both situations. During this podcast episode, I am going to discuss the important documents necessary when thinking about getting divorced. I am a divorce attorney in San Diego, California. Oftentimes, I get asked what documents are important to have when thinking about getting divorced. In other words, what documents should a client bring to me so I can review them in trying to come up with a plan for their divorce matter? This question is asked by men and women equally. One thing to consider, of course, is how much access one has to important documents. Generally speaking, I have found the person who pays the bills has more access to documents than the non-bill paying spouse. Now, this doesn't mean it is impossible for the non-bill paying spouse to find important documents, but what it does mean is there is going to be more of a challenge for them to do so. It also means that they will need more preparation time in advance of meeting with their attorney, which needs to be thought about prior to making an appointment. Now, the actual documents which are important to gather when divorcing can vary. For instance, if a couple owns property, it would be important to have mortgage information, including the amount of principal and interest paid, and of course, any title papers. For vehicles, it is a good idea to have the make and model of the car, their loan information, and title papers available to be reviewed by an attorney. As I stated earlier, I am a divorce attorney in San Diego, California. I have clients who own their own businesses, and it is important to have those legal documents available for review. For instance, it is important to know the amount of capital used to open their business, also the amount of money that has been invested in the business since it began, and the salary each spouse has received from the business, of course, assuming they both have worked for the business, and obviously the value of the business before marriage as it existed then, the value of the business during marriage, and finally the value of the business at the time of separation and or divorce. Other considerations that are important to consider are things such as goodwill a particular spouse has provided as a result of working or managing the business. Now, this is an issue that can be further explained in other podcasts because it would take a podcast of its own to explain it. Retirement documents are also important to gather. For instance, if a spouse has a 401k plan or other types of retirement such as a pension, then it will be important to have as much information about those accounts as possible. Information such as whether the retirement plan was started before or during marriage, the balance in the account when it was opened, the gain or loss during marriage, any reinvestments during that time, and finally the balance at time of separation. Similar to this information is having bank statements and other investment accounts readily available to be reviewed. Now again, it is extremely important to know the amount of the investment prior to marriage, the gains and losses and reinvestment information that occurred during marriage, and finally the balance at the time of separation. Other documents that are important to have are credit card statements, because this will help determine both the amount of debts that the parties have as well as their living expenses. It is good to know this in order to allocate who pays these debts as well as the amount of support necessary to help cover a party's expenses after divorce. As a family law attorney, I do not usually worry too much if the documents are not available at the beginning of the matter. As long as my client has an idea of what assets and debts the parties have, the relevant documents can always be obtained later. The most important thing is to gather as much information as possible from the documents that are available. This helps in both preparing to ask the court to make temporary and eventually permanent orders, and also in determining the correct proposal in cases of settlement. To inquire further about more specifics of divorce and the documents necessary to begin the process, you should consult with a local family law attorney who can discuss this process as it relates to your specific situation. In San Diego, California, contact the law offices of Brian A. Victor for more information. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast, and feel free to contact me at my website at www.brianvictorlaw.com for any suggestions you may have regarding future podcast topics.